So welcome to the third webinar in the series around Australia's Lost Conversations. My name is Mark Yettica-Paulson. I'm the practice lead for Deep Collaboration at Collaboration for Impact. And today I'm joined by Liz Skelton, co-founder of Collaboration for Impact, and by Sarah Maddison, the co-director for Indigenous Settlers Relations Collaboration. I had to practice doing that to get it right. But we're really pleased that you've joined us for what is a tough conversation for Australians to have. It's a tough conversation for First Nations people. So we find ourselves having to ready and fortify ourselves for this time of year. It's a time of year where we also see predictable patterns in phrases that come out at online, but also at barbecues and things like that, and in our social realms where people have various viewpoints on what should happen, must happen, ought to happen for January 26. And we wanted to include this as part of the series because we started the series on the conversation during NAIDOC in November, which in itself was a bit weird for us. But NAIDOC in November reminded us that this land always was and always will be First Nations land. And what that means for the exercise of sovereignty for us as First Nations people is one of the kind of pointier ends to the more domesticated, let's just keep it as always was, always will be. That's a nice turn of phrase. And then we had that conversation in November as our first one. Then we had the conversation in December about the traditions that we again see as repeat patterns here in Australia. And we asked ourselves the question, so what does that mean for us to keep doing traditions that have been brought across by the colonial, brought across by the settler community, and for us to adopt them and to play them out on this land? What does that mean for us in terms of our sense of belonging and who we are? And now we find ourselves here in January, 1 week away from the 26th of January, and we know that we will see all kinds of conversations rise up and show themselves and around different ways that this day means for various people. So I want to encourage you to engage, listen well, but also listen for the kind of conversations, the kind of things that might trigger you for what this means for you and how you might reach some ouch points, but you might reach some aha moments as well. So I'd like to hand over now to Liz, who'll talk a little bit more about what this means for our work at Collaboration for Impact as well. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Mark, and hi everyone, good to join you here. I'm on Bundjalung country and I just want to acknowledge the land that we're all meeting on today, the land that you're on, to pay acknowledgement to traditional owners of the land and forthcoming leaders, but also to acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So I'm joining this conversation today really with the lens from Collaboration for Impact, which is that we exist to create an equitable, inclusive society. And what we're aiming to do is to try and look at how do we address some of our biggest complex challenges by building capacity to be able to think and work systemically. And in doing that, what we're acknowledging is that one of the conditions that need to be changed is for us to build a collaborative capacity in Australia to address the unreconciled history of colonisation that is playing out and maintaining systemic racism. And really, I guess what we would say is for many of the adaptive complex challenges that we face in Australia, that this unreconciled history is really the core of a lot of it. So hence why we're really interested in how we can develop deep collaboration when we're trying to address the complex parts of it, but also think about how do we actually do that? What does that mean on a day-to-day level? How do we take different positions? How do we work with a range of different positions? January the 26th is a classic example of this, and we see it as a lightning rod for all the unresolved, untalked about issues around identity, belonging and race in Australia. So looking forward to seeing where we go with this conversation today.
Thanks both of you, and thank you again for having me on this call to prod and poke you along a little bit. I'm coming to you today from beautiful Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, part of which is known as the city of Naarm or Melbourne. Here on Wurundjeri territory, it is the season of Birrup or high summer. There are 6 Wurundjeri seasons rather than the 4 that Western society has decided belong here. But during the season of Birrup, we can expect some dry weather. We can see the native grasses are long and lush. We can see the Southern Cross high in the sky to the east at sunrise. And it's generally a beautiful time of year here. And as always, I am deeply grateful for the place that I am able to occupy on Wurundjeri country, for the relationship that I have with the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, which is really intrinsic to my work in the Indigenous Settler Relations collaboration. That's a research unit I co-direct with my Torres Strait Islander co-director, Sana Nakada. So it's Birrup here in Naarm, but it is also, as Mark alluded to, a season where I see Indigenous people around the country start to gird their loins for a real struggle ahead. Every January, I see First Nations people brace themselves as the 26th of January comes closer, knowing that this is a season where the culture wars revive themselves, where Aboriginal protest is required to reassert Indigenous sovereignty. And I see First Nations people doing the work of trying to force the settler colonial nation of Australia to have a series of difficult conversations about what it means for us to hold our national day on a day that for First Nations people is a day of mourning, a day of celebrating their survival, and a day of anger at the continued colonisation of their territories. So those are some of the conversations that we're going to get around in the next hour or so. Can I encourage you all to use the Q&A function in Zoom? You can type questions in at any time during the conversation and I'll get to them as we go or at the end. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function and Michelle will try and help you out offline. But for now, we're going to get into this conversation and we're going to start by trying to map some of the landscape, map the system that we see operating around the 26th of January. Whether we call it Australia Day, Survival Day or Invasion Day, there are some big positions here that we want to try and understand. So Liz, I'm going to start with you. How do you understand the positions that sit around the 26th of January?
So I'm looking at this, I guess, from the lens of it being an adaptive challenge, that we see the 26th of January being a lightning rod around, we have a day that traditionally Australia has designated that it's a day to celebrate culture. And I think that in itself is curious, actually, about why do we need a day to celebrate culture. And that day is also the day that marks when Australia was colonised by the British. So I think what we've seen play out, I've been in Australia 20 years, and as you can hear, coming from Scotland originally, I found it quite curious when I arrived. I arrived in November, and then January the 26th happened a couple of months later. And I was like, what is it people are meant to do on this day? And pretty much since then, I've seen this kind of confusion playing out. It's probably the best way to describe it. So there's a number of, if you like, factions that we see coming forward, some really strong positions around, like you've already framed, Sarah. For First Nations people, it's either a day of mourning, it's a day of survival, to acknowledge survival or to acknowledge genocide, or it's a day of celebration of culture. And then for others, it's a day to celebrate a kind of idea of what it means to be Australian. We see that depicted mainly through the media of, you know, having Barbies, having Australian flags, I think playing cricket, ferry rides. And then there's other people that I think for whom it's a public holiday and don't really know. And I think that there's a growing other group emerging, which is starting to call for, can we find a way to actually be inclusive and be able to have a way of celebrating Australia, which speaks to the reality of the country that it is today. That is where most people are born overseas, and that is a country where, for First Nations Australians, that history has never been reconciled. So I think what we see playing out is a whole range of different positions on that, and a growing dialogue and a growing calling around either changing the date, maintaining the date, but at the core of it, I guess what I'm interested in is what is the adaptive work that we are avoiding by looking at a particular day. There's another conversation and there's deeper work about what it means to be Australian and what it means to actually move forward and be inclusive that we're probably not having.
Mark, how would you expand on Liz's articulation of those different kind of positions around the 26th of January?
Yeah, look, I think there is a, the kind of more visible positioning of we love it, we hate it, as kind of opposing views on whether January 26th represents something to be celebrated, something to be enjoyed, or whether January 26th represents something to be despised and to not enjoy it. It is a remembrance of things bad. And in those two kind of polarized positioning, you've got people doing all kinds of different work to either maintain that or to try and shift that, to try and change that. And what I see is that, there's a lot of work being done by First Nations people to try and do that navigation. We will do some stuff on trying to make sure that we can communicate clearly about why it still is painful, why it still hurts, why it's still unacceptable, why it's a signal, a trigger of trauma for us. So we'll do that work, but then we'll also do the work of caring and carrying burdens for our community and for people who, a number of people, like one of the strategies for a number of people is to say, look, I'm going offline. I'm just shutting down all kind of conversations. I'm not looking at the social media. I'm not looking at media coming through other, sources. I'm just going to try and zone out, because the predictable conversations form patterns that look like they're never going to be resolved. But then you've got First Nations people also doing the work of educating their fellow Australians, or just educating other people in society and community. And that work around the education is around what's the history of the day? How long has it been marked as a national public holiday? And like you said earlier on, Sarah, there's lots of people doing lots of work to help fellow Australians, to help Australians go, oh, right. So that's why you, oh, okay. So, and then they ask us more questions. So when did it first? And when, it's like, so we have to go right back to 17 and then right back to all of those sorts of dates to go, here's the 250-year history that perhaps you may not have heard of. But then we're also doing other work around navigating our own sense of nationhood and sovereignty in relation to what this colonial date marks and what it means for us. There's a whole range of stuff going on, and you've got First Nations people at this moment, some of them preparing for how they might take up their role as being named as a Australian of the Year at a state level, or perhaps even taking it up at a national level. And so what does that mean? You've got First Nations people organising for the protest to maintain the rage against this colonial impost, this colonial thing that's been placed on us. So in that whole range, you've got people trying to find a way to move beyond what we currently have. And for me, the systemic nature of this is that if we park ourselves on one of those and say that the other side is our enemy, then it still asks, to me, it still begs the question, how do we move 25 million then forward to something? What is that something? And the reason why we titled this a new national day is to not say this is all about changing the date, kind of a one fit solution. This is about trying to find a way that 25 million Australians can say, yeah, this matters to us being here on this land. And how do we do that?
I want to expand some of that spectrum a little bit, because I think in recent years there's been another kind of stretch. I mean, I think it's actually always been there among the activism by First Nations people around the 26th of January. But I think in the last few years it's been articulated much more clearly, or maybe it's just that I've moved to Melbourne. But I think that there is a real distinction now between the change the date mob and the abolish the day mob. And I think that one of the parts of work avoidance that non-Indigenous people do, and we'll come back to the idea of work avoidance in a minute, is throw up their hands when they see Indigenous people disagree with one another and say, oh, well, we can't possibly engage in this conversation because, even the blackfellas can't agree with one another. So can we just map that a little bit more? How do you understand the distinction between First Nations people who are arguing to change the day, who say it's still okay for Australia to have a national day, but we don't want it on the 26th of January. That's a harmful day, a day that it causes us grief and anger. And then there are those First Nations people who say, no, Australia can't have a national day because Australia is still a colonial imposter, as you say. We're still illegally on Indigenous lands. We haven't negotiated treaty. We aren't in lawful relation with Indigenous peoples. So it's not proper that we celebrate a national day at all at this point. How do you navigate between those positions on the spectrum?
Oh, really difficultly. I mean, it's not an easy thing to try and find the way to move through those sorts of positions. But part of the challenge in collaboration is to understand why it matters so much for those positions to be held. So why does it matter so much for people to say, we can't actually celebrate a day? And you get people saying, they'll say, look, we can't do a national day in its current form. Let's all look towards finding a treaty day, and in a way that being our celebration because we've done the justice right and got the settlement right. And you'll find other people saying, look, if they want to run around and do their thing, then let them do that as long as it's not painful for us. So you got even in those shifting kind of positions amongst First Nations, you've got a whole range of ways to cope with that. To me, the sad dynamics that occur is then when we start as First Nations people, but also, all of us, when we start to delegitimize each other in those differences of nuanced positions. Because as I said, there are First Nations people who are trying to do the work of guiding and leading many other Australians and educating them on history in order for them to go, oh yeah, I get it. And we also have First Nations people saying, I'm here to stand very strongly and very, to be abrasive, to do the activism that's required to get people to the change. So we kind of, I think in our last conversation in November, we talked about how we need that orchestra of responses. And this is one of those conversations that needs it as well.
So I think we've all referenced work avoidance here, and I've suggested that amongst that orchestra is one of the ways that non-Indigenous people actually practice work avoidance. We look to Indigenous people for a unified position, otherwise we apparently can't hear the orchestra at all. Mark, do you want to say a bit more about the idea of work avoidance? And we might talk about some of the patterns that we see in work avoidance around this date in particular.
Yeah, so I first came across this terminology, work avoidance, when doing adaptive leadership programs with Social Leadership Australia. I don't know, what was it, 20 years ago, Liz, something like that, 17 years ago. And the notion that work avoidance as a thing is the kind of stuff that we engage in when we think it's useful and we think it's doing something, we think it's contributing, when actually it's not getting to the heart of making the change that's required. We're actually setting ourselves up to avoid the work. We may do this by focusing on what might seem like a very technical and simple solution to a hugely complex problem. And we say, oh, look, if we only did this one thing, we'd be okay. I said to Liz in the conversations about how one of the suggestions for change the date is to shift it to May the 8th, because May the 8th means you say mate. And it's just like, okay, well, then everything will be solved. Let's just shift the day and everything will be solved. All Indigenous injustice, all the stuff. It's like, that's an example of a piece of avoidance, because it's a technical shift to a complex problem. But the other thing we'll do with work avoidance is that we will look for distraction. We will look for a context, maybe even overseas. Oh, let's look at what New Zealand's done. Let's look at what Canada's done. Let's look at what every other country on Earth has done, and let's study that for maybe in the next 20 years. And then we'll, say, okay, we're still not addressing what's going on here. But the other thing in work avoidance, like you mentioned, Sarah, is let's find reasons why we can't engage in this. And we will all find those sorts of reasons. I cannot talk to those people because they're not aligned with me. I cannot have that conversation because it's to those people, there's differences of opinions. And in doing so, we take ourselves out of the solution possibilities. And that, to me, is why work avoidance in this particular context is hard for us to take up. We shouldn't take it up, because we need to be engaged in this conversation to try and bring about some kind of way forward. Liz, do you want to add to that in terms of what this looks like in this context from your point of view?
Well, some other forms of work avoidance. I just want to say, when we say work avoidance, people think that means that we're not doing anything. And I think what's clear about January the 26th is there's a lot going on, but what we're often avoiding is doing the adaptive work, which is about actually engaging with the other side and the other sides on this. So scapegoating isn't leadership. Scapegoating an idea or a person or a point of view is often avoiding some of the adaptive work. As you said, Sarah, looking to Indigenous people to tell us, white people, how do we do it? How do we show up? What do we do? Isn't us addressing the adaptive work that we need to do. We deny that there's even a problem. So for many people, it's kind of like, what's this all about? This conversation we're having today won't even be an issue for many, many Australians. They just won't be involved in this and won't care and won't really understand what it's about. That is a form of work avoidance as well. And I think what's important, though, is that when them by themselves don't mean we're avoiding it. We need technical solutions. So this idea of changing the date, that may be one part of an adaptive challenge, as long as we're also looking at, well, what else is going on underneath this? The idea of, we could change the date, we could find a new national day. And then what do we do around addressing what it means to be an Australian, and what does it mean to acknowledge our history and to reconcile our history and move forward? I think what we tend to see is that we'll have a technical solution people will get behind, but actually those attitudes still remain under the surface. So if we are approaching this adaptively, it means we've actually got to lean into those harder conversations. I think other signals of work avoidance that we can see playing out, in our communities, our families, whatever, is that we put the blame somewhere else. Depending what news channel we tune into, we may hear that it's it's a politically correct nonsense gone mad. It's the loony left. It's the whatever. We like to scapegoat it, but we also get that on the other side where we, kind of talk to other parts of society like, they're dumb, they don't get it. It's really easy to demonize the other. And I think why this is particularly critical now is that, we only need to look to the Northern Hemisphere at the moment to see the results of work avoidance, when we've been kind of sold a way of of leadership, and we've been able to buy into polarized positions without looking at how do we engage and actually listen to some of those other voices and engage with them, which is the adaptive work. But I think, first of all, we've got to recognize the work avoidance that's playing out. How might we be colluding with it? And what work avoidance are we doing? Because we're all taking part in it somehow.
So I wanted to push again into this work avoidance area, because I think over the last few years, I've increasingly begun to think that this idea that part of the work that needs to happen is the education of non-Indigenous people. That if non-Indigenous people understand the historical reality or understand the continuing fact of colonisation and the implications for Indigenous people, that there will be change. But when I look back over the last few decades, you know, that was the reason, for example, that Bob Hawke walked away from his commitment to a national treaty and gave us 10 years of a reconciliation process in 1990. He explicitly said that the non-Indigenous population wasn't ready for a treaty, and so that we had 10 years of that was basically education. And when I've done some follow-up research with non-Indigenous people, randomly selected non-Indigenous people with the kind of people, Liz, who might not have had a view on this, randomly selected from the population, it's very hard to see the impact of those education programs. There were a lot of people, we asked specifically about the 26th of January in those sessions, and a lot of people said it was very, very important. We had to keep the 26th of January as our national day. It was very, very important because that was the day Captain Cook arrived. Actually, no, Captain Cook arrived on the 19th of April, 1770. It was Captain Arthur Phillip who arrived on the 26th of January, 1788, and began the invasion and colonisation of Indigenous territories. So we circle back again and we say, oh, well, we need to do more education. We need to bring more non-Indigenous people, you know, up to speed and along with this conversation. And I wonder, is that also a form of work avoidance? Could we stay stuck in this idea that the work is to educate the non-Indigenous population forever? Do we see change as a result of that work? Because it certainly is work, and I certainly see a lot of First Nations people doing that work, but I'm not sure that it's ultimately work that makes change.
So I might just speak to that. I think there's a number of ways to answer that, you know, knowing our history, knowing the history of this country is clearly important. We've learned when people forget the lessons of history around the world that we tend to repeat those things. So I think there's that. But actually with adaptive challenges, it's often not about knowledge. You know, it's not about not knowing. It's actually about what people value and what they care about. And that we have conversations which are able to surface that. So I think, Sarah, what you're saying, there is, you know, that we could look at that and go, yes, maybe there's some knowledge people need, but actually, if we're facing this adaptively and systemically, we'd be looking at, well, what is it that people care about? What do they not want to lose? What are the things that they value that they're holding on to, which has got nothing to do with knowing. We know we could kind of fill rooms with all the reports around systemic racism and the impact of colonization that continues, and they don't change people's arguments. They don't change people's minds. Same with climate change, that we can't kind of convince people with facts. And so I think this is where what we're working towards is, how do we create spaces to have that dialogue that we actually don't want to have, that we don't want to hear that other side. And how do we build that muscle to be able to really engage with the different viewpoints to find out, well, where is the shared alignment and how do we move to that? We'll come to that later, but yeah, I agree. It's not often about not knowing, it's maybe about not caring, or about caring about different things. And how do we then move forward as a country when we all care about different things?
Yeah, I certainly agree with the notion that it's not about having more and more data, more and more information. A theory of, you know, we'll reach a tipping point and where everyone will go, oh, I can now see the light. You know, it's now going to shift the way we are. the kind of stimulus to change has got to be more than just I now know and understand. It is about the level to which people will feel the necessity to make the shift. They'll feel the necessity to adjust their value, to make a change, to embrace a different type of attitude. That movement doesn't come with just knowledge alone. That comes with the kind of things that change people's lives, the kind of experience, the kind of moment where it becomes, I get it. I get why I need to now think and feel and do and be different. Part of the catch with this kind of dynamic, though, is we often see the necessity for authentic experience and authentic kind of moment of shift and change, needing a First Nations person to be there to make that happen for you. And then you do the quick maths with that, and that again puts burden on First Nations people. Come and bring an authentic and life-changing experience to me so that I can shift my attitude, because I've read a book and I still don't get it, and I need you to be there to make it shift for me, and then I'll change the way I have an attitude towards January 26. And we can't afford to do that for First Nations people, but we also can't afford to do that because we'll be back here next year, 12 months' time, and we'll be looking at patterns and dynamics, and they'll look remarkably similar unless we've had the kind of shift, not just from seeing the light and getting more information, but from changing the way of the who we are and the how we are.
And maybe we can just spend a couple of minutes on the kind of work avoidance that the Prime Minister recently dressed up as a substantive change by changing a single word in the national anthem. It relates to this same question, I think, this idea of national identity, this idea of how we celebrate or don't celebrate or mourn or rage against the European presence on these territories. This idea that in our national anthem we are now one and free rather than young and free. This was presented as some adaptive change. I think it was presented as we've listened, we've heard First Nations people say that describing ourselves as young and free ignores the 60,000 years of at least Indigenous presence on these territories before the arrival of the British. And so instead now we're one and free, which I would say repeats exactly the same problem in that it erases the several hundred sovereign Indigenous nations that existed and continue to exist on these territories prior to European invasion and colonisation of these territories. So, and then I think that gets thrown back at Indigenous people. Well, you know, we changed the anthem. We said sorry. We walked across the bridge. We had a reconciliation process. What more do you people want? And I think that comes up around this day in particular. You know, is there any way that we could have a national day that would make you people happy, that would make you people feel like you're one and a part of this nation? And I wonder how you navigate those dynamics. You know, I think I hear a lot of First Nations people say they're sick of being, you know, the angry black person or the ungrateful native or any of those kind of tropes that have played out historically. And yet you're almost forced to hold those positions by the way in which these discourse plays out in public.
So you could look at, I guess, that symbolism from the Prime Minister around the national anthem in a number of ways and see it as symbolic along with other things. And that, you know, the different things you've just listed, Sarah, like the walking across the bridge and the apology, that are symbolic kind of signals of some kind of shift. They may not go far enough, but from a systems perspective, you could say there are signals of some kind of readiness that's starting to shift. The difficulty is that when they are the only things that are happening, they're not going along with the broader adaptive work, that it doesn't stick, that it just stays as symbols, that the lives of First Nations people don't change very much, and that the lives of how we work together as a country really doesn't shift. So I think that again, the important thing here is to think about this as, yes, it could be a symptom of work avoidance, but how do we test that? You know, we could sit here and say, yeah, well, it doesn't go far enough. How do we test that in terms of how we then engage in the broader adaptive work? And why are we only looking to people like the Prime Minister and others in authority to do that work on our behalf? And I would say that's where the work is, that a lot of this is playing out, either that it's First Nations people who are leading it, or it's being led in the media, it's being led in, you know, we're seeing it in the political life. But the questions I would be asking is, how is this actually playing out on a day-to-day level for most Australians? And that maybe that's where we need to look, is instead of looking for those symbols elsewhere, what is it that we could be doing? And what does leadership look like for all of us on this? And the many leadership moments that we're presented with. I know we're going to come to what can we do about it. But I think, again, the preoccupation that we have in looking at the signals we're getting from our leaders is also part of the problem. And it's also work avoidance, because we then jump to anything that we see there. And we often maybe don't look at actually what's happening, where are communities making progress? And we see those signals, you know, in a lot of the work we're doing where communities are taking leadership and they're creating their own solutions, and they're not looking for those symbols from people in political authority. They're getting on with work. So again, I think it's, where do we put our attention? What do we focus on? You know, what are we listening to and what are we listening for? And what does that then mean that we're not paying attention to? So yeah, this just evokes more questions for me.
So I like the way you mentioned that dynamic there, Liz, about how we look to the leaders, and perhaps that's even a bit of avoidance. You know, can we have you know, if the leaders can make decisions, and then we're at a barbecue and we say, oh look, but we've done this, we changed the anthem. No, you didn't change it. It was the Prime Minister made it. So you get that dynamic where there's a bit of avoidance just because the leader's in authority. But you also talked about testing together. And I think this comes to the heart of why a deep collaboration, why collaboration for impact, when we're having these conversations, is that we need spaces where we can test together, where we can come up with, I think this was sufficient to help us move forward, and then have other people say that was insufficient to help us move forward. That's not enough. Or then what else do we do? And to have that dialogue in an environment where we can manage the sense of our own sense of righteousness that I've done the right thing, but also rage that the thing was not right and it needed to be more or needed to be done differently. And one of the dynamics as well in the collaborative effort is to really try and investigate what are people afraid of losing? What are they afraid to lose by bringing about more First Nations recognition? What's the fear that's going to happen? And who is maintaining that fear, that structure of fear that will continue to be in place if First Nations people begin to really have their rights asserted and recognised in the colonial structures? How do we have that conversation when one leader makes one change of one word, and then you get so many millions saying, well, the work is done, let's move on, let's keep it. And then you have so many other hundreds of thousands of millions saying, that's not enough, we need to keep moving. So this dynamic around how do we investigate what people are afraid to lose, but also how do we create an environment where we can test together? And this is not about Mark finding people who think like Mark and they'll go, yeah, you're right, brother, you say whatever you need, and then everyone continues to agree with me. This is about me putting myself in an environment where there'll be people whose values are different to me. And they'll say, this is my desire for something that helps us to move forward. And it probably leads to the other question, are we trying to find the shared purpose of this National Day? And what would be the shared purpose? What would be the vision of a shared purpose for that National Day? Because I remember back to our conversation in November, Sarah, where we talked about how, I talked to you about how being invited into the colonial structure as a slave, as a servant, is not a very tantalizing job opportunity. And it was like, this is not what this whole thing is about, where it's a colonial structure says, you can be part of us now, but you can come as servants. And that's been around for, you know, the last 200 years, that mentality. And again, we see this with, we're going to have January 26th, If you get a piece of it, you should be happy with it. You should be grateful for it. The challenge for me is to think, where can I be in an environment where I can really test those ideas with people who are putting that forward, and to not have it boil down to us and them, I'm right, you're wrong, and that kind of polarizing conversation.
So you've raised the issue there of a shared position on moving forward. And Liz, you've also talked about shared values. And I want to spend some time on that. I guess one of the questions for me that comes up around this day is, what if there isn't? What if there isn't a shared position? You know, for me, I know we're going to touch on what's noble and righteous, but for me, I think there is a moral line in the sand that says, as a nation, we are not lawfully in relation with First Nations people yet, and until we are, we can't have a national day. We can't. And we certainly can't expect First Nations people to want to join in that National Day. And I think that the struggle for Indigenous people to keep asserting their sovereignty, to stay alive as nations during a 200 plus year of ongoing colonisation is real, and it's debilitating and it's exhausting. And to suggest that Indigenous people should have to somehow move or compromise from that, the daily reality of that struggle to somehow find a shared position with people who want to celebrate a national day seems, you know, abhorrent to me, actually. Shared position, and what might that mean for the kind of dialogue that you're talking about? Mark, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. My apologies, Sarah. My internet connection just missed a little bit of that, but I got most of it. The whole notion of what it means to try and cultivate shared vision, shared purpose, is essential to any movement forward on these sorts of complex issues, on these sorts of complex situations. And what you've illustrated is how difficult or challenging that is in this context. So I just want to mention or give a shout out to anyone who works in local government, because in many ways they are on the front line around this. How do we get a shared purpose, a shared vision for our local community? Because, you know, maybe 10 years ago, we didn't really think too much about the impact that this had on First Nations people. But now we do, and we're reconsidering how we do this at a local government, and they are paying a price for that. So some local governments being applauded for their maintaining the status quo, and other local governments being penalised, or in other quarters also being applauded for their desire to shift and change and to not have kind of branded celebrations on this day, on 26th of January. And to me, that typifies this challenge around how difficult it is to create a shared value or a shared belonging or a shared sense of purpose on these sorts of issues, in this type of conversation. But it also highlights for me how necessary it is. So my positioning around wanting a deeper conversation space is because the way I see the future rolling out, or the way I see the future adaptive change or adaptive challenge for Australia, means that I've got to do my bit alongside many millions of others. And if the many millions of others don't get it, then they're going to be seduced and reduced to the status quo position, and they won't even say, oh, Mark, I don't know what you're talking about. So I've got to do this work of cultivating a shared purpose with them, so they go, this is why it's important. I also then need to partner with and have in that orchestra people who bring the tough and painful reality to their knowledge as well. And this goes back to what we also talked about in November. You've got to have both, and you can't just have one piece taken as the solution. So the work we do in collaboration is a necessary part, is a difficult part to do, but then the work that is done to maintain the Indigenous sovereignty position has got to be there as well.
And just to build on that, I think the question you're asking, Sarah, kind of gets to the core of like, how do we address complex challenges? And that, you know, your question about, is it even possible to get a shared value or to get a shared purpose? And it may not be, but the work actually of starting that engagement to actually understand, first of all, what is it that people value? Where is their alignment? We'll uncover it. So I don't think any of us could sit here right now and go, the shared purpose is this. We could, but it would be my idea of what that should be. And that is actually the work, is by aligning together. And, you know, we've seen globally that where people have been able to do that across, you know, really entrenched lines, that they've been able to find some areas that they align on, even with people they don't like or trust and will never, ever agree with, that we may have moments where we can actually align on something. And if we think about what we're sitting in at the moment, leading up to 26th of January, you could say that when you dig under the surface of some of these really entrenched positions, from people who are trying to maintain status quo and keep Australia Day as it is, and people who want to change it, that you could say that underneath both of those positions are people who really have pride in their culture and really value their culture. Now, it may not be the culture or the side of Australia that I necessarily value, but that doesn't matter. It's something that people are hanging on to and they're proud of. So I can understand that, even if I don't agree with it. And we probably feel that we're going to lose the same thing by bringing about change, is that we may lose that culture, or we may lose that identity that's important to us. So to me, the kind of, it's in the process of actually bringing that together and having moments. And it may be that that's all you get, is that you get those moments of alignment, and then you're able to really leverage those for some parts of the population. And I don't see that work is happening yet. So I think it's exactly because it's not happening that we're trying to create spaces through deep collaboration to go, let's even just start having these conversations together. And what might we learn by doing it?
We've been talking around in this conversation about the idea of trenches, about holding, you know, strong positions in opposition to one another. Do you maybe, Liz, want to just take a minute to explain this idea of trenches in relation to the work that you're doing in deep collaboration and collaboration for impact, and yeah, how that might play into this conversation?
Sure. I mean, we see, you know, what we're trying to do is kind of build awareness around, there's a number of dynamics we see when we come together to try and talk about culture and race in Australia. And one of those patterns that we see is that, you know, we start from a trench position. So we're either saying, no, we're not going to collaborate, we're not going to come together, we're going to do the work. We see that on the First Nations side, where First Nations people, there's an activist role, and that work needs to be done. And then we see other people in other trenches. We see it across black and white. We see white people go to our trenches, where we go, oh, we don't know enough. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to be called culturally incompetent. We will be culturally incompetent. We're going to do all these things. So I'm going to stay in my trench because it's nice and safe here. And we also see that playing out on the First Nations side. And I think it's important to say is that might be absolutely the right place for you to take action from. And a lot of this work is going, you know, where am I best placed to have an impact? If I want to bring about change, is it from the trenches? And can I do really important work there? And we need that work. But we also need work in the middle to kind of be able to create spaces to bring people together when it's a complex problem that neither trench can fix by themselves, that we need to come together to actually figure it out and work together and come up with a solution that works for a whole community or a whole part of the population. And that's hard work. It's hard work in the trenches, but actually to sit and hear the other side, even when you don't agree with it, when you don't like or trust people. And we see there's a lot of First Nations communities involved in that work at the moment, and they're leading their own solutions, but they're doing that by, you know, working with people in government, working with people in community and business, where they're having to take up a different role. And And at any one time, people may well go back to the trenches because it's comfortable there, and we start playing the usual scripts. But actually what we're talking about in deep collaboration, sometimes we've got to then take up different roles and new roles, like the listener, like the collaborator, like the person who will turn up the heat and hold conflict and not let us slide away from the hard conversations. And these are all roles we can occupy, even if we do have a fixed position on something. And I think a good signal for that is if you're taking a fixed position on something and you feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall, you could be stuck in that role. And that to kind of let go of that role, knowing someone else will be there to pick it up. You don't need to play it, but you might be getting a bit predictable in that position. And there may be other roles that you can play in that context to try and make things move, and it gives you room to move. So that's a lot of the work that we're doing on the ground, is working with collaborations to find out where are they stuck and where might they be able to take up different roles, and what other options are there beyond the trenches. The trenches are important, but we need other positions too.
Yeah, so what we found in the conversation around deep collaboration is that so trenches is used, it has a bit of a connotation of, old ways of warfare, battling, but we also describe these things as, almost like being stuck in position, or even as camps on opposite sides of a riverbank. There's a sense in which when you're on your side and amongst your mob, your peoples, you feel competent, confident, you feel like people here understand you, they get it. And you can use shortcuts. You can say, yeah, them mob over there. And they're like, yeah, that's right. I can turn this way and say, we're right, eh, cuz, yeah. And we're right, eh, sis. And we all know that the others are the problem and we're okay. And we can be stuck in a conversation space, and whether it's a trench or a camp on a particular side of the riverbank, it keeps us there. It's just important for us to feel like we've got strength and solidarity. The other reason why we talk about trenches in this context as well is that when you start to climb out and move across to the so-called other side, you feel that tremendous sense of I'm selling out to my own mob and I'm at risk of attack. And plus I've made myself vulnerable to the other side and at risk of attack. And you can see why it is so popular to stay away from that middle ground on these sorts of issues. So when you try to say, how do I collaborate with those who hold a different position on January 26? How do I collaborate and have dialogue with someone who has who's had different upbringing and therefore different values on what a national day in Australia looks like? That becomes a risky, dangerous proposition, because you'll get people saying, what are you doing over there? Why have you sold out from our camp and you're going way over there? They don't like you over there. They'll do you in as soon as you walk across. So that notion of collaborating in this context, it becomes useful for us to think about trenches or campfires or stuck positions. But the other dynamic with it is it helps us to realize that we're holding something valuable and important. If we can see that on our side, it is only logical that the others on the other side are holding something that they value, that it's important for them, that they think is worth fighting for, resisting, and maintaining. And so the collaborative effort then is about, so what do we do here together? And yeah.
Something just I want to push on a bit there. It does seem to me, though, that there are significant power imbalances between those camps, and that for First Nations people, as still a tiny minority or group of minorities, that solidarity is important for survival in a way that, when you're talking about the mass of non-Indigenous people, even though there are, a number of different camps or trenches among us. But, if I drop out, I guarantee there's 10 people to step into my place. I don't rely on solidarity with my peers or other non-Indigenous people in the same way as I have, for example, if I've been an activist in a small movement, where actually being in that trench, being in that camp is a way of staying alive. And so I wonder, Mark, your reflections on that, because if we very crudely talk about two trenches or two camps. They're just not the same in number, in power, in voice, in influence.
Absolutely. And I think that we cannot have this conversation without the exploration or the acknowledgement of power imbalance. It's a little bit like how, today in the United States, it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And so people like to use the more domesticated or palatable quotes of Dr. Martin Luther King, because it all talks about us being together. I don't like using the quotes where Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about the necessity to change the economic structures and to look at labor and to look at how where there's discrimination happening to all parts of American way of life. And in a similar way, we're doing that here, is that we like to look at the togetherness, the hopefulness, the being one and free, and we're not really, it's more difficult to look at the power imbalance, the overburden on First Nations to help us lead through this conversation, to collaborate with us. And yet our country needs it. Our Australian population needs a different way of doing this. Otherwise, we will find ourselves, and this is, again, why this has come up for us as a deep collaboration. It is a classic example of repeat pattern to show that we are in work avoidance. The patterns keep coming up every year, and we do need to engage with it as First Nations people to shift it. But the recognition of the power imbalance is really, really important, that we recognize also the power to make the change is also imbalanced, has that imbalance. And so therefore there's lots of people who see my fellow Australians say, what can I do? So, well, there's a big power imbalance here. You could do actually quite a lot. Yeah.
And I think this speaks to as well why on a complex challenge like this, it can't be done by, First Nations leaders being the ones driving this. And we started the conversation off in that way, talking about how a lot of the work falls to First Nations leaders. And I think this is where, if we're looking for signals of ripeness and readiness, I'm seeing a growing language and awareness, particularly among younger people, around power and privilege and around the need to be literate around that. I mean, it was never something in my 20s that people really spoke about. People spoke about where power lies out there, but not awareness of their own power and what privileges that gave them. And I think that that's an encouraging sign that we're seeing more and more. And it's very fundamental to the work we do in deep collaboration, that if we want to bring about change, we've got to be working with awareness and have language around power and work with consciousness of our privilege and what that affords us, and to know where the context we have it and where don't we. But it means we've also got to align with and partner with people who've got different types of power. So I think maybe, rather than thinking about it as power imbalances, thinking about it as different kinds of power that people have access to, that we can partner with to make progress. And it's certainly not something that can be done. Your question there, Sarah, about alliance, and if we only think about it as two camps, then that's when we're in difficulty. So we want to try and expand that thinking a bit so that we can all access different types of power when we need it. When do we step forward? When do we step back?
We're just coming up to 1 o'clock here on the East Coast anyway. And so I'm going to start moving to some questions. We've got a couple that have come in, but please use the Q&A function if you're listening in and would like to ask a question of anyone on the panel or the panel as a whole. One that I think Michelle's actually sent in, I think is really interesting. She's drawing attention to Wesley Enoch's vigil at Sydney Festival, which is a big public event taking time on the evening of the 25th of January and overnight until dawn. We've seen a growth in the kind of dawn service commemoration on the 26th of January that's clearly riffing off the invasion, the Anzac Day tradition. And Wesley's using that vigil to try and highlight what Australia might have been like before invasion, and to contextualise that, and to I guess to try and take the heat out of some of those polarised positions by creating a space or an experience that people can share, and in order to grasp some of that complexity. So your thoughts on that type of intervention?
So again, I think when Liz was talking about signs or signals of readiness, the fact that that Wesley is doing this work, the overnight vigil, the dawn service, and the fact that it's also reached the consciousness of Sky News reporters, for them to say, there is this thing, and this would be a good thing I'd like to go and attend. It's changed the dialogue. It's shifted the conversation space. And from a adaptive leadership systems change point of view, you need interventions like this so that people can shift their language, can have a different way of framing how to treat a national day. When I heard the signals from what would be considered more right-wing or conservative analysts talking about how starting what they called Australia Day with a morning of a dawn service to acknowledge the pain and suffering, it's, I struggled, and I had to fight against my resistance to hearing that and saying, yes, that's not enough. But then to try and hear that wouldn't have occurred 10 years ago. And to hear the shift in possible ways forward is created by work like that, like Wesley has done. I know that SBS NITV also do a similar kind of dawn morning thing for January 26th. There's work that's being done by First Nations people to try and bring about a shift in the way Australians see this day, 26th of January.
And I think this is a great example of where, there isn't one way, and that it requires different sectors to test and try different things. And, often it is the arts and culture that can create an experience that people can be involved in, and it can shift them through experience. I think that circles back to what we talked about earlier, that often it's not knowledge or facts, but actually being in something that helps you see something a bit differently, or standing in someone else's shoes. The question though is is we can have lots of these events all around January the 26th. But, I'm sure many of the people who are on this call are working in this space going, how can we nudge this day to day in their jobs and their work that they're doing all the time? So we can have this to take the heat down, and we also need other things to keep the heat up, and I guess that's what we're seeing. If we take a systems lens, we're going, okay, we can reframe over here and we can keep the heat on here, and that all of these things can collectively be helping nudge conversation in a different direction. And then the question becomes, well, what does it look like for me then to exercise leadership? How can I take that up in my day-to-day? We can have things which are set up for people. And I wonder if, as we're kind of coming to the end of the conversation, that if we think about this as that we all have access to leadership moments. And I think in the kind of complexity we're in today, we can have 5 or more leadership moments a day where we can choose, are we going to actually step into this or not? And that may be where we're in a conversation and we know that something is being avoided around this, and we just don't want to go there, and we decide not to. Or it could be when we're in this conversation, we hear that the typical view that comes up that presses our buttons, that we can react in the way we get into a ping pong argument, or we can listen and we can inquire, and we can kind of listen for, well, what's actually the song beneath the words, if you like, what's not being said that, we may not want to hear, because it's actually easy for us to be on our soapbox and take a position on this. And I know for me personally, and a lot of, the work I did in my earlier years was very much in the activist space and taking a position on things. And it can be really comfortable. And as a white person on this issue, while, you know, I've stood in the heat and taken pushback when I've taken a position, it's actually, I've had to find other roles that I can play as well, to go, how do we bring people together and hold that heat of different positions? That we need all of those. But I think it's, you know, it's really, it feels good. It feels good to be able to be right. And I don't know that this is a conversation that, you know, we've got that luxury on, actually, that we've got to engage with what we see as other people's truth and what they think is right as well, and find ways to do that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I come back to some of the questions I had earlier around that point, that a lot of the work that I see happening around the 26th of January is being is being done by First Nations people, and I see the toll that that's taking. And you know, I do see that there is a moral line to be drawn around what that middle might look like, that can't, for me, involve First Nations being asked to compromise or shift their views on their own sovereignty. It's an abiding fact of First Nations people's existence, is that they remain sovereign peoples of these many nations and territories on this continent. That's a historical fact. I mean, for me, I think what's at stake for a lot of non-Indigenous people in persisting with a celebration of like Australia Day, persisting with a national day that commemorates the invasion of this, is a re-legitimizing of our position, our legitimacy on this territory. If we can celebrate it, it must have been a good thing. If we can have a barbie and wave the flag, then, you know, it is doing work. It's doing work to actually shore up a position of non-Indigenous legitimacy on these territories. And I really get stuck there. And I think a lot of non-Indigenous people don't know how to move. They're either in that camp in solidarity, and would find it very difficult to shift out of that. I know that I would. I think it, like a lot of non-Indigenous people, it probably took me a while to get there. Probably took me a while to kind of, I grew up, I think, experiencing some of these transitions. You know, it was a very uncomplicated Australia Day when I was a child. By the time I was in my late teens and early 20s, it was pretty much survival day. And, you know, I was going to those early Yabun festivals in Sydney down at La Perouse. And over time, it's become a more vocal assertion of Invasion Day. So maybe that's progress. But if it is, how do we contemplate a shift from that doesn't feel like backsliding, I guess, on some of that progress?
So I think what you're speaking to, Sarah, is how do we take up different roles that allow us to make progress and yet facilitate the loss that kind of shift means. So for First Nations people to have sovereignty in Australia means that mainstream Australia, there's going to be some kind of loss or shift. And I think we're experiencing that. And a lot of the pushback and the language you talked about, culture wars at the beginning, that even that language that's starting to appear more and more is positioning it like that. And I do think Australia has an opportunity that, you know, again, looking to the Northern Hemisphere as a warning rather than example, is to do this in a way where to engage with what is being lost or perceived to be lost, but not avoiding that loss. I think it's our avoidance of the loss that keeps us in the stuck position and stops us moving forward as a country. So I think that's the work, is to think about the shift is happening. And it's happening slowly. So how do we engage people so we don't end up with a country that is completely polarized and you know, some kind of war, which is what we're seeing in the US at the moment, because there has been little space and no space to engage and have the dialogue. You know, and this is where I kind of look to the wisdom of things like deep democracy, to to think about that if we can engage with that voice that fears that it stands to lose the most in this, then we can go, well, what do they need to come along? Like, this train has kind of left, you know, the change is happening, this change is going to be coming about. But what do we need? And how do we listen to that minority voice? We may never be able to, it may never be able to be met, but how do we bring that along to, you know, those age groups? If we think about some of the polls done recently, there's very much a demographic shift that older Australians are the ones who are agreeing there needs to be an Australia Day and holding on to that. For younger people, their experiences of, you know, coming from and knowing people from many different cultures, and it means something different. So the change will come, but in the meantime, can we do that? We can't do it in a way which minimizes loss, but can we do it in a way which allows us to hear that loss and try and bring along as many people as possible?
Mark, what do you think about this idea of loss?
Well, I'm thinking about the kind of the journey that you've had with your own relationship to January 26, from childhood to where you are now. And I'm thinking about how, for myself, equally, there was not many spaces talked about what we could do differently. There was a very active and radical presence amongst First Nations people in the early 70s. But then there wasn't the space where Australians really considered that proposition that was being tent embassied and, you know, placarded. It was like, oh yeah, that's those people over there in the corner, marginal. And I see how in the last 20 years we have moved from a conversation that was to a conversation that is now. And for me, the sense that a shared vision, because part of the work with adaptive leadership and systemic change is that you need to hold on to something that goes beyond what your current role or what your current position is going to be in charge of, you know. So it's got to be longer than just Mark involved in a particular process. It's got to be when I'm even more grey, even more older, and I've got grandchildren. It's the 20-year ahead kind of vision that we need to be holding on to. So if we take it from where we were 20 years to where we want to be in 20 years, it shifts the conversation about to January 26 or to not January 26. It becomes much more about how in 20 years' time, the kind of way that we want to mark a celebration of being on this land as a community of people, as communities of people, as some kind of boundary of this sense of nationhood that we can hold together. We want it to be different in 20 years. We want it to be qualitatively different in 20 years. And we need to hold on to that kind of vision, that kind of arc of a trajectory of the future in order to make our efforts, our nudging efforts that Liz talked about earlier, at a very local and practical and meaningful way. And for me, that starts to think, so what are the actions I can take that can nudge this conversation differently so that when I am in my 70s, that the activists of that time won't be saying, you need to recognize our First Nations people, you need to recognize our sovereignty. You look at where the treaty conversation is in Victoria at the moment and where it was 20 years ago, you know, so where do we want it to be in 20 years' time? Well, you know, in a sense of resolution and partnership and ways moving forward.
I just want to pick up there, you mentioned the kind of radical positions of the 70s. In my work over the last few decades, particularly looking at social movements, I've really come to appreciate how significant it is for any movement trying to make change to hold on to that radical edge. Where movements start to struggle and fall apart is where that radical position becomes co-opted, becomes taken up by a liberal agenda. I think there's a real risk with that, actually, with the current treaty process in Victoria, and that radical position has to be not just protected, but constantly pushed out. That's the pointy edge that actually allows other change to come in behind it, and where that's tempered, where that's toned down, where, you know, movements start saying to people, well, you know, now that we've got this meeting with the minister, we can't invite you into the room because you're too radical. It's the beginning of the end. We've seen it with the women's movement. I think we've marriage equality might be the same concern for the LGBTIQ plus movement. Like there is real risk there. So how does that idea sit alongside this idea of shared values, where we're almost saying to those radical activists doing that work, no, you stay out there. You know, we need you to keep pushing. We need you to keep prodding and drawing us further. How does that sit with the kind of conversation in the middle type ideas that we're talking about today?
Yeah, so from my point of view, in terms of not only political strategy, but also doing the work of collaboration, you need to bring the heat because of the power imbalance of what we are, how the position we're starting from, but also the power imbalance of what we are asking the 23 other million Australians to shift and change. There has to be sufficient heat for that to be recognized, to be seen as, oh, okay, we do need to shift. And if we ask people on, you know, to tone that down, to quieten it down, then it may not be visible anymore. It may not be heard. It may not be audible anymore. And that has to always be in this tension between, but that doesn't mean everyone storms the castle. Not everyone kicks the door down. Not everyone demands with, you know, flag waving and beating like we've seen in other scenarios around the world. But it does mean we still need that heat to be brought and the sharp edge to be brought, because the collaborative effort and the power imbalance in this context here in Australia means that we won't have a conversation about January 26 and a 20-year agenda for a more the evolution of a national day for us as Australians. We won't even be able to have that conversation if more and more of the 25 million people feel like, oh, there's nothing to be seen here. There's no problem here. It's all safe sailing.
And I wonder if it comes to as well thinking about shared purpose as opposed to shared values. You know, when we've got different positions, we absolutely won't have shared values. But what we may have is that, you know, we could, if we even start the dialogue, and I guess what we're saying is that there are very few spaces to come together to have these lost conversations, but to think about, well, what is the Australia we want to create? And normally, you know, with any group that I've worked with over the years, when you start to ask these questions, most people pretty much want the same things. There's not much deviance from that. People want, you know, a safe community. They want their people to be looked after. They want people to be treated well. And, you know, regardless of sector or geography, I hear the same things whenever I ask people those questions. So I think even that, starting that dialogue about, well, what's the shared vision, the shared purpose, and then acknowledging we've got very different ideas about how we bring that future reality about, is the work that we work across that. But I think the work of protecting the marginal voice is really important. And, you know, it may be that we're the marginal voice, you know, even having this conversation today. The role of the marginal voice is really important. And if you're in a position of some authority, when you see that it's there, how do you provide protection for it? Because people are going to be watching all the time to see how is that voice treated and what happens when it shows up. Now, the thing is that those roles or voices can become really predictable. And I think that's also where it's important. It's not just about being radical. It's actually about, well, are you being effective as well? And I think that's where the work is, that we can be radical, but nobody might be listening. So, you know, there's work needed. I think this is where we see everybody's got to do some work to think about, how do I take this role up well? But how do you make sure you protect that marginal voice? And if it's not showing up, if in the conversations we're having in our communities or organizations, everybody's sitting nodding and nobody's bringing that in, then it's often our role to bring it in and to speak to it and bring it out, because we know it's there. So I think that's also something that, you know, we all know what the radical view is on something that we're trying to take action on. Even if we don't agree with it, how do we make sure it's on the table so that it can be considered? And I think this is where the more we expand our way of working and think about it more systemically, then we move away from this is my view and this is your view. That let's bring in all the views, whether we agree with them or not. And then we can actually look at, okay, how can we work across these different views? So I think it's really important we protect it and we bring in the no. And we also know when we might be stuck in the no voice ourselves.
We're going to just take a couple of minutes to wrap up before we let everyone go and eat some lunch. As part of your wrapping up, one of the first questions that came in was how do those of us on the panel commemorate the 26th of January? So maybe just in your concluding comments, you might both just say a word or two about what you will be doing next Tuesday.
I was about to say, Liz, do you want to go first? And then she went on mute. So that means me. So let's see. This January 26th, I will be starting the day in the same kind of attitude as many Australians are familiar with, the kind of dawn service of Anzac Day. So the beginning of the day is one of contemplation about the reality of our history here in this place and the reality of what has happened and what continues to happen as a result, and what continues to happen in Australia. So that's how I start that day. I don't treat it necessarily as the celebration and let's go party, but I do embrace the fact that it is a national public holiday and I don't work on that day. You know, I know that there are others who like, I just work on that day and it doesn't matter. For me, it's like, okay, I'm actually off on that day. And it's partly because I also have kids at school. And so when they're off, it gives me a chance to be with them. But the whole notion of where we end up on that day, I do want to try and find a way that that gives some kind of recognition to this country that is here, where it is actually a great country, but we still have tremendous, difficult and tough conversations about very hard reality. And one of them is the legitimacy question. So that's going to be rattling around for me as I try to enjoy a public holiday, but I'll certainly start it with that kind of solemn beginning that we see in an Anzac Day. And that'll be me. I probably won't have lamb. And I'll probably have some kind of plant-based stuff, or maybe even kangaroo, but it won't be lamb.
Thanks, Mark. Liz?
So I think, like I said, when I came out here 20 years ago, I was curious about this day because in Scotland, we never had a Scotland Day. I didn't grow up with the idea that you have a national day that you celebrate. And I think I've always found it conflicting. I've just moved literally a few days ago and I'm still on leave. So I will be on leave. I'm in Bundjalung country now. So if I've moved from Newtown in Sydney, I would have been at the Yabun Festival in Victoria Park. Is traditionally what I've done is gone to the kind of celebration of Survival Day and First Nations culture. So I'll be looking to see what happens here where I am, and I'll be on leave. And I think I'll still be in that kind of conflictual. I've never done the Barbie part because I'm a Scozzy, so I don't quite know how to do all of that other part as well, even if that's what I was being drawn to. So yeah, I don't know, it's a confusing day for me, but I'd be drawn to the Survival Day celebrations. Sarah, how about you?
Well, I'll be out of the city, taking a few days down on Wadawurrung country over the weekend and into Tuesday. So, but if I was in Melbourne, I would go to an Invasion Day march in solidarity with all the First Nations people I see doing that hard work, spending this week painting banners, organising, marshalling. You know, these big events don't happen by themselves, and it's almost completely First Nations people doing that work. I really value the collectives of allies that come together. So there'll be a big No Pride and Genocide contingent at that rally. I think those groups are very important in encouraging people to connect from other places where they might feel marginalised or excluded or powerless in society, in solidarity with First Nations people, and to say, you know, none of us are free until all of us are free. So I think those things are important. If I was in town and there were invitations to barbecues, I would definitely decline them. I have been at enough barbecues on the 26th of January and had enough completely pointless arguments on that day to recognise that that is not a useful contribution to make. But I think for me, always the most important thing is to understand what's important to the people on whose land I'm living. What do Wurundjeri need next week? To know what my colleagues, my Indigenous friends and colleagues need. That extends from January 1 as far as I'm concerned, when I see the faces become set and the jaws begin to grit as First Nations people recognise what's needed to get through this month. So that's hard, that's ongoing, and that starts well before the 26th of January. So, and like a lot of people, I will be glad when the day is over. And that's not to say the work doesn't continue, but I think it's a difficult and painful day for too many people I care about. So that's me. And we are just about at time. So I understand this conversation's being recorded. So if you've enjoyed this conversation and you want to share it with friends, please register or get in touch with Deep Collaboration and Collaboration for Impact to access that link. It's been wonderful, as always, talking to Liz and Mark, people who always stimulate my thinking. And I hope that for everyone who's been a part of this call, there's been some poking and prodding of your own thinking around what the 26th of January might mean, what it does mean for a range of groups, and what it could mean in the future. So thank you very much for being a part of this conversation.
And thanks to you, Sarah, for hosting and poking and prodding.
It's what I do best. Thanks all.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Everyone, thanks.
Thanks. Bye.